now going to turn to our second witness, Stacie Hoffmann, Digital Policy Consultant at Oxford Information Labs. Good morning, Stacie.
Good morning.
You have spoken in the past about terms of service and the fact that social media companies love sort of trumpeting their terms of service and how they do all they can to enforce them. Are they wrong in this approach? And what is wrong if they are in this approach?
So I think it's important that we take a kind of a historical look over the last few years. So we've been studying this since 2018. And when we first looked at 37 different terms of services from the social media companies, we found that they all had in the period up to the 2016 election cycles and then post that, they all had the ability to counter misinformation that was being shared on their platforms, but they weren't enforcing their own terms. So that means that they weren't taking down content, they weren't suspending accounts, they weren't placing notifications on things. So in the first instance, their reaction was very, very slow. And it was really reactive to what was coming out in the news. So the first big changes we started to see were end of 2017 and then into 2018, when things like Cambridge Analytica became front page news. For Facebook, for Google, there was a Holocaust deniers issue that was being highly populated in their search queries. So they responded to what was happening then and started to look at and enforce their own terms and then slightly modify them as well. And so I think what we've seen since about 2018 to now is really a lot of testing and refining of different tools that they can use. Elections and politics have obviously been a really big focus for them, and that's been globally. So they started a lot of their initiatives in the US or in Europe, and those have now populated and replicated in different countries around the world. COVID is, I think, a different type of stress test for these platforms, because we're really starting to see what they can do in some senses. And so I think that it's true that they are enforcing their terms more now than they were before, but they also don't necessarily have a lot of terms specific to misinformation, disinformation, or false news. They're using other tools in their toolbox to do this. For instance, spam is a very common policy that's used against misinformation, because that helps to take down bots or automated accounts that are helping the spread of junk news. Impersonation is another long-standing policy that they use, and that can be useful, for example, when you're looking at electoral jurisdiction. So if you have somebody claiming to be the leader of a Tennessee GOP right-wing party in the States, but they're actually a Russian troll, which is what had happened on Twitter, then you can start using that as start taking forward the impersonation policy to take that down. They've announced a number of different things to kind of enforce their policies. So one is human content moderation. Facebook has hired thousands of people to help with their human content moderation, which before all of this came about, they were really hush-hush about their use of people and really they tried to focus on technology for that use. Ads transparency.
Sorry, just quick question. What you're saying there effectively is that they've turned away from A1 then, effectively, as a means by which to do this, or are they now seeing the value of people?
So it's not that they didn't see the value before. They did have a network of human content moderators, but they liked to promote the idea of technology being able to identify misinformation or harmful content online. They didn't want to talk about human content moderation. This might be because it's a very sticky subject to have somebody sitting at a computer screen looking at sometimes really horrific and abusive content. And it takes a lot of oversight and a lot of care for your staff as well. So I'm not quite sure why they weren't talking about it, but they definitely had plenty of human content moderators before, and they've expanded that now. Yes.
But I'm going to bring in Julie in a second to ask you a question, but just just in terms of disinformation, is what I think you said is effectively the terms of service are so broad that there isn't anything specific to do with this. Is there a need for it?
So it depends on the platform. So Facebook does have in their community guidelines, they have a section on fake news, but it's not very clear exactly in terms of what they take down versus what they reduce the reach. So they tweak algorithms. That was a huge response for them since 2018, is that they're all taking up these algorithms or AI to help this issue. And so they started tweaking their algorithms to reduce the reach of content. But it's really unclear at what point they start taking down content. And so the terms of service that are directly related to misinformation or junk news tend to be very high level and confusing, whereas they can actually employ other types of policies much more effectively. That's what we've seen so far.
Yeah, it's a common refrain, isn't it? If you infringe copyright, then they're very, very quick on it. But if you're spreading fake news and disinformation across all social media platforms, there doesn't seem to be that sort of focus on it to that extent. There's a little bit to do with it. Julie Elliott.
Chair, and welcome, Stacie. I want to build on what you have just answered to the chair there. How effective do you think the social media companies have been in the challenges posed by COVID-19? Because really it's more of an infodemic than fake news. It's a slightly nuanced thing that they're dealing with. How effective do you think the various platforms have been in dealing with that?
Thank you for your question, Julie. So they've been very proactive related to COVID-19 versus other areas of disinformation. I think that would be my first reaction. So we saw in late February, early March, the first kind of notifications of actions that they were taking or plans that they were developing. And so instead of waiting for the infodemic to really explode, which happened by the end of March, they were taking some earlier steps, which was very welcome, I would say. But it's also clear to me, it's becoming even more clear that public health information is being treated differently than political information or political speech or other types of speech on these platforms. So for example, Facebook has a policy that they do not put any oversight on political speech, and they allow political ads on their platform. However, they did take down a post by Brazil's President Bolsonaro because it went against World Health Organization guidelines on COVID. So we see them re-looking at their own policies and applying them differently in this space, I think because it is a public health emergency. And so we're seeing them develop tools in their toolbox, and it's really interesting. So common things that they've done is they've given free ads to authorities. And so World Health Organization, local health organizations, NGOs, they've put in more restrictive ad policies. So you can't advertise things like respirators or face masks or hand sanitizer. It seems to be that they've increased their takedown and notifications as well. At least that's what they want you to believe. I don't have data on that to see if that's really true. They're promoting authoritative content in a few different ways. So they've got portals that you can go to that they've curated content for. And then they've got these different tweaks to algorithms as well that they've been working on. So it'll be really interesting to see if the policies and practices that they put in place here for COVID, which I definitely welcome. I think it's a step in the right direction for these companies. It'll be interesting to see if they use these going forward, if they stay in place post-pandemic, if they refine them to be used in times of electoral processes or in everyday speech online. A good example of this would be on YouTube. Google has taken down advertisements from videos that are spreading junk news or false information about COVID-19. And in our most recent study that we've yet to publish, we found that Google and Amazon are the two biggest ad providers for junk news purveyors. And those are the websites that are getting those click-throughs to try and gain money, right? It's part of an ecosystem, a round ecosystem. Well, we've known that there's a plethora of websites since 2016 that have been key purveyors of junk news. Why do they still have ads? Why are they still making money when we've known this? So if YouTube can do this for videos now, can Google now implement that in the wider ecosystem of misinformation going forward?
So it sounds to me as if what you're saying is that them having an attempt to use their mass influence on people for in a positive way to try and help in this pandemic. Am I right in thinking that's what you were saying there?
Yes, they definitely are. They're starting to be a bit more bold in the tools that they've got and in it actually implementing them, and doing so quickly as well.
Yeah. And there's lots of differences between the actions of the various big social media platforms. Which ones do you think have been doing it better, and what are the best tools that you think they've been using that perhaps the other companies could take on board from them?
Yeah. So I think that so Google in particular, if you look at, say, Google, Facebook, and Twitter, Google is kind of an outlier. They have a much bigger umbrella of what they provide, and of course, Google search is one of their key areas that key businesses that they have, and so they really focus on technical tools instead of policy tools to respond to these issues. But it seems to me that they're the only ones that haven't implemented a report function. They have one on YouTube, but not in their search. So if I was,
do you think they should have one?
I think they should. Why not? So if I'm searching for something like something about COVID, and something like Breitbart is the first website that pops up in a search. This hasn't happened, but just say it did. I would want to be able to report to Google that I don't think this is the right content to be showing me in this search, or some kind of feedback loop there that they don't have in their search function. Now, on the other hand, Google has tweaked their algorithms, and we know this from studies that we've done and that we've seen, that they have tweaked their algorithms since 2016 to help reduce the prominence of junk news or misinformation in their searches, but that those also come back up. It takes about not even a year for the reach of those websites to go back up again. So it's an iterative process. And I think that these companies really need to acknowledge that this is an iterative process that will be changing. There's another good example from Facebook. So most recently, they have implemented a tool where they are going to inform people who have engaged with misinformation on their platform. This was just a couple of weeks ago. And this is something that's really important because it feeds into what's called an inoculation theory, where you start being proactive and you start showing people what misinformation is and educating them about it so that they can more easily identify it going down the road. And so it'll tell people if you've shared, if you've commented on, or if you've liked a piece of misinformation. And this is particularly important in a period like the pandemic, where what was misinformation today might not have been misinformation 2 weeks ago. Yeah. At the same time, they're not telling people who saw or who read that piece of content. Facebook knows how long somebody stays on a piece of content. That's one of the data points that they collect. So they know that even if you didn't like it, that you at least reacted or had some kind of engagement with it. They could also be notifying those people as well. So they are taking good steps, some more than others. And I think, they can always go a little bit further.
Thank you. Kevin Brennan.
Very much, Chair, and good morning, Stacie. I was quite interested in what you were just saying about advertising and it strikes me there's a very uneven playing field here between social media companies and traditional broadcasters. Do you think it's fair to say that we've seen a transfer really of advertising away from broadcasters who have to follow standards and regulations in the presentation of the news that they're required often to present us with, particularly public service broadcasters that rely on advertising, and social media companies who effectively are taking that advertising revenue away from those traditional sources and using it in effect to finance fake news?
So there's definitely a regulatory gap between what we see, say, on TV or in print news and what we see on video, not streaming sites such as Netflix, but things like YouTube or Facebook or Twitter. And that is that as you go from traditional media down to something like YouTube, there's less and less regulatory oversight. So that's absolutely true.
Do you think there should be effectively the same regulatory oversight for advertising on social media platforms as there is on Ofcom regulated broadcasters?
I think there should be appropriate regulation, definitely. It's not a case of being able to just copy and paste the current regulations onto online platforms, because it's a different type of media. It's a completely different ecosystem as well. But there definitely should be the same expectations and same kind of levels of restrictions or expectations of the actors involved as there is in current regulations for traditional media. So I think it's very tricky when we start talking about regulating online spaces. It is a bit trickier, but that doesn't mean it can't be done.
Can I ask you, Stacie, have you seen any evidence that platforms provide any funding or support for quality journalism to try and counteract some of this information on their platforms, before or during this pandemic?
Yeah, definitely. So before the pandemic, there was a lot of focus put onto this, and during the pandemic as well, they've actually increased their funding or support for quality journalism and fact checking. So one is that they definitely have been, they do this in a few ways. So one is supporting journalism itself. Google has an initiative to try and help journalists change their business models and attract more subscribers through their services. So that's one area. Fact checking is a huge, huge area for these companies that they're trying to help traditional journalists by bringing in fact checkers to kind of support and push people towards more well-known news sources. I think Facebook probably relies on fact checking a bit too much. They're actually taking responsibility off themselves and liability and trying to put it on fact checkers, which is not the best route, so to speak. But that's another way. Media literacy programs as well. The big companies have worked. So Google had a program in the UK that they supported some media literacy for people so that they could identify fake news or how to engage with news, things like that. And then, of course, electoral outreach has been a big one as well. So during electoral cycles, they've reached out to governments, to campaigners, to help them learn how to use platforms and how to use media better and things like that. So they've put a lot of money behind this. And during COVID, there's been a huge amount of money. So Twitter, for instance, has put some money behind two journalism projects that are focusing on minority and women journalists to try and support them through this difficult time, since they know that their kind of funding will have gone down.
Okay. Thank you, Stacie. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Clive Efford.
He's muted himself.
Clive, you're muting yourself. Could you unmute yourself? Great, brilliant.
Sorry, I thought you could unmute me, but I beg your pardon. So Ofcom's research has found that most people disregard misinformation they see. What would drive people to disregard information that they get from authoritative sources, or actually believe information that they get from sources that actually appear authoritative? And what concerns do you have about that?
So countering disinformation is very complicated because there's been research that shows that once you start engaging with the material itself, you kind of come out at an equal footing. So you end up with somebody who probably won't believe the misinformation, but they won't believe the fact either. They'll be in a middle ground. And that's very worrying, because that in itself will diminish people's trust and reliance on authoritative sources, which is a huge push right now by these platforms, is really pushing authoritative sources for information. So you need to really get ahead of the curve. I think that's the key here. And that goes a bit to the inoculation theory, which I myself haven't done a huge amount of research in this area, but it is about educating people beforehand about how to engage with media online and how to identify something that is looking for an emotional response versus something that's really trying to engage you intellectually. And that's what a lot of the disinformation does, is it elicits a very strong reaction one way or the other. But we do know that the algorithms are rewarding negative reactions.
And so I mean, we've had questions from previous witness about influencers and people in positions of authority that may influence people. Do you think that there's a requirement on them to be more responsible about the messages that they relay and their sources of information?
So this gets into a really sticky area, particularly if you're looking at policy or regulation. And at what point do you start taking a normal, for instance, human being who just happens to have thousands of followers on Twitter or Facebook and start treating them differently than, say, myself or somebody else? But when you have a platform that reaches that far that quickly, I think there is a level of responsibility that needs to be taken on board. And so this might be something that is down to the platforms to enforce. It might be something that the UK looks to educate people or put in a kind of guidelines for, in terms of who influencers are and what our expectations are of those people. So it gets quite tricky, but I do think that we need to really look at that. Public figures as well. We talked a bit about them being influencers. And when we did our research with the Oxford Technology and Elections Commission, we found that having a public registry of public officials, official campaigners, something like that, would be actually really useful for all of the parties involved, because it would help us keep those, have oversight over those actors and really hold them accountable to how they're using social media. It would help social media companies know how to impose their own policies on particular users, and it would help fact checkers fact check what's being posted. But most importantly, it would give the public somewhere to go for reassurance that the account that they're following is the account of their local MP or of a campaign that they want to donate time or money to. So it's kind of a good check and balance for everybody. Now, you can't necessarily apply that to influencers broadly, but that is something that we can do on a local level, particularly in the electoral space.
So, I mean, just can I mention the issue of President Trump and bleach, because this issue has been around for many, many years. There are some very sinister individuals and organisations behind, just promoting ordinary, everyday cleansing bleach as a medicine. I came across it as being promoted as a cure for autism, and parents were being encouraged to give it orally to their to their children to cure autism. And some people were taken in by this and children became very ill. When it comes back to this issue about fact checking, what responsibility, what sort of set of guidelines would you advise for people in positions of authority before they repeat things that are so obviously wrong, but also extremely dangerous? I mean, I found that the Food Standards Agency nor the Medicine Regulation Agency could do anything about these people who are promoting this. It was very disturbing indeed. So when a politician repeats something like this, it gives oxygen to some very sinister operators indeed. What would you say about that? What guidelines should politicians follow when they're using their position of authority to promote something?
Sorry.
Well, this is getting into, a very sticky area where you can't necessarily take away free speech either. And so it's really about, I think, being able to have authorities that people trust. And this is where trust really comes into play. And we need to reinforce those trusted relationships so that if somebody, an influencer, whether it's a politician or not, says something online, that we have trusted authorities that we can go to and really get that information from. So there'll probably have to be an increase in engagement from all parties as well. We can't put all of our reliance on fact checkers. Right now, there's just not enough capacity there. So one way would be to develop capacity, but another way is to look at, when it comes to political speech, and if you also look at the way that we apply offline laws online, we really need to just stick to the laws and the regulations that we've got in terms of how we address political speech. And we need to apply that online. There is this disconnect where regulators in general are being very cautious about how they approach the online space. But if it's illegal offline, it should be illegal online as well. And we need to make that clear that they have the authority to take action when needed.
Thank you,
okay, Clive? Do you want to come out one more question before we move on? All right, great. Thank you very much, Stacie Hoffmann, for your evidence today.